Welcome to A Real Affliction, BPD Culture and Stigma, a podcast devoted to exploring how we experience, treat, write about, advocate for, and conceptualize borderline personality disorder. Need to give trigger warnings for suicide, rape, child sexual abuse, and self-harming. When I studied Japanese literature in college and grad school, I was struck by the prominence of the Nikki Bungaku, the poetic diary genre. In Western literature, diaries seem to often be treated more like primary sources for an author's life rather than masterpieces in their own right. But they can be both, and the Japanese tradition views Nikki Bungaku as its own literary genre, as revered as poetry or novels. Women diarists flourished during the Heian period, 794 to 1185 AD, Japan's golden age of literature. Murasaki Shikibu, the Heian's most famous author, is known less for her diary than for the tale of Genji, a story of court life that is arguably the world's first novel. But her diary, among others of the period, innovates as well by celebrating female subjectivity and showing how women view love, marriage, the past, old age, friendships, children, travel, the seasons, loss, and death. Today, diary writing remains a unique genre. With each entry bound to a particular date, a diary is woven into a particular time and place in a way that most literature is not. In this way, it retains what critical theorist Walter Benjamin would call its aura. Before works of art could be mass-produced, Benjamin argues, they were tied to rituals like magic or religion and imbued with cult value. That is, they played a particular socio-cultural role. When photography was introduced in the 19th century, Benjamin writes, quote, "It is no accident that the portrait was the focal point. The cult of remembrance of loved ones, absent or dead, offers a last refuge for the cult value of the picture. For the last time, the aura emanates from the early photographs in the fleeting expression of a human face. This is what constitutes their melancholy, incomparable beauty." In the case of posthumously published diaries of people who died young and tragically, this cult of remembrance and melancholy, incomparable beauty becomes even more poignant. These diaries are literal still lifes, giving us the illusion that the authors are still with us, still alive, and still intimately engaged with us, even as we mourn them. Today, I will read excerpts from such a posthumous diary. I Might Be Nothing, Journal Writing, is a selection of writings from the diary of Lara Gilbert, compiled by her mother, Carol Itter. This book is a product of what scholar Jennifer Douglas calls grief work, record-keeping that is enmeshed with bereavement. Carol Itter spent years going through thousands of pages of Lara's diary and deciding what would best encapsulate the life of her daughter. Lara Gilbert was born in Vancouver 2 years before me in 1972. She collected tiny objects and stickers just like I did. The inside cover of her first diary, started at age 8, features the same sticker of a Renaissance fair maiden with a unicorn that I owned. Lara devised genealogies for her stuffed animals like I sketched out librettos for operas and curricula for imagined classes that I would teach someday. When I went through her materials in the archives of the University of Victoria, where I teach, it felt like I was meeting a friend I'd known all my life. As we'll hear later in this episode, Lara and her psychiatrist debated a BPD diagnosis. Based on her diary writing, Lara displayed at least 5 of the characteristics for BPD: identity disturbance, dissociative episodes, chronic feelings of emptiness, recurrent suicide attempts and self-mutilation, and self-destructive impulsivity in at least 2 areas. In her case, drug use, and prostitution. However, her relationships weren't marred by the tumult and terror of abandonment that are hallmarks of BPD. While I am not a medical doctor and thus am not qualified to make the diagnosis, it's possible that Lara may have suffered from complex PTSD due to child sexual abuse rather than BPD. Complex PTSD is a common comorbidity with BPD and has disorder. But regardless of her diagnosis, I was originally drawn to Lara's diaries because she and I shared a history of abuse and a love for books and writing. She wrote that the perpetuity of words is the joy of writing. To know that every little mark written down has a meaning that ties into the meaning of the marks around it, forming the patterns and passages of words and sentences that are unique as snowflakes, is the joy of a great writer. To hope to achieve this joy is simply joy, period. Lara intuited words' power to construct this world or even a new one. As a young girl, she decided to cultivate her own secret language. She writes, "I remember when I couldn't yet print, and I wanted so much to because there was something magical and powerful about written language. I would fake it with little figures and symbols, showing my mom my sentences. And once I learned to write, I tried inventing my own alphabet and language as well. Kawiaki, or mush, as I called it earlier, but everyone laughed, so I changed the name, was more than a secret code for me. From 26 letter symbols and a number system and a few basic words, an entire world came into being. I fantasized and dreamt about it, wrote stories and an attempted novel set in it, put together a life story of myself about being actually born there before Goshiba, the being or God, I guess you'd say in English, transferred me to this world. So my search for why am I here came to be, why was I put here? Her childhood and pre-adolescent years sound happy on the page, but a dark shadow was falling over her. In December 1988, at age 16, she wrote, "Something happened which triggered a memory of mine, one which I've kept totally secret for so many years. It's a haunting, nightmarish memory, even more so since it is one of my first memories. It shaped my character, my personality, my future too. I thought on the drive home that I might finally write it all out, pull all the secrets and memories that incident resulted in, but I just can't. That something that happened," as she became convinced over the next few years, was that her father and paternal grandfather had sexually abused her as a child. While processing this, she started to engage in self-destructive behaviors, even as she maintained the facade of a high-achieving pre-med student at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. She used heroin and overdosed on pills, sometimes ending up in psych wards. Laura felt like nothing inside them, writing, "I want to remember Lara Gilbert, but she cannot be present in this world. I left her outside in the night sounds and trees to wait. Every evening, she will whistle to me from the wet green grass below my cell and beckon. I can never manage to break the brass window lock, so I just stare and wrap the curtains around my shapeless body. I might be nothing. I think I'd like to be a sound. Then I could penetrate through walls and windows and connect people." Yet one of these psychholds taught Lara that her self-harming behaviors weren't unheard of. The psychiatrist in emergency asked me if I ever cut or scratched myself. I couldn't believe he knew to ask this. I thought I was doing something totally freakish that no one, not even lunatics, do. Lara's memories compelled her towards Hastings Street, Vancouver's Skid Row. "I love the city. I needed to try to understand what makes men view women's bodies as objects and sex as a substitute for happiness. I got to experience what it's like to be an object, a meaningless piece of flesh. I need adventure. No matter how low grade or sleazy, I want to feel alive." She acknowledged that she may have been attempting to relive the sexual abuse of my childhood, she wrote, but this time I'll be able to defend myself. Unfortunately, she couldn't. She was raped soon after. She writes that a wealthy, respectable man picked me up just off Hastings, and the deal we made was a blowjob and eat out, which refers to oral sex on both our parts, no pun intended. After that was accomplished in the car, lovely big one with plush seats and cellular phone, I said I had to go, but he insisted on mounting me. The rapist gave her $20, not enough to pay for the perm she wanted to buy with it. Even after this assault, prostitution still attracted Lara. Sometimes, she writes, the thought of returning to the streets disgusts me, and sometimes it's so alluring that I have to give in. I'm being reckless and impulsive. I have to stop this soon, but it's like an addiction. She was glad to break free of it when she could. I'm doing great generally, she writes, but occasionally I do feel a sadness, like right now, a sort of empty feeling. I'm yearning for something to fill it, but I can't figure out what. It's not exactly a desire to sell my sex, and for that, I'm glad. Certain nights, she just wanted to be present in that lost world. Sunday night 2 weeks ago, I went to Main and Hastings and walked around the alleys, eventually sleeping in a doorway. Surprisingly, the urge to hook and buy heroin disappeared. All I wanted to do was be there. As the night proceeded, I felt more and more disconnected and unreal. Kind of a relief because it prevented me from feeling anything much. Another evening, after writing a poem to sift through her choices, hooking, shooting up, wet alley, studying, living, Lara spent the night curled up in an alley once more. She said sleeping there brought relief, like finding, momentarily, a missing piece of myself. In February 1993, less than 3 years before Lara's death, she was sexually assaulted by a male orderly named Kevin while committed, supposedly for her own protection, to the acute psychiatric care ward of Vancouver's University Hospital. It took 2 years to bring Kevin to trial. After facing her rapist in the courtroom, enduring a hideous cross-examination, and listening to all of the implied slander about herself when the defense attorney made a big deal about her history of prostitution, Lara was devastated by the verdict, not guilty. She writes, hearing it was crushing. It felt like they were telling me I had not been raped. I made a fuss over nothing. I wanted to have sex with a strange man while committed to a psychiatric unit because of suicidal and dissociative thoughts. The verdict is logic-defying, particularly because it pivoted on the idea of consent. As Lara clarifies in her diary, I did not resist the assault because I implicitly trusted that he would not assault me. He was in a position of authority, and his breach of trust was shocking and overwhelming to me, so that I felt frozen. For the sex to have been non-consensual, the law says he must have exercised his authority, not enough evidence he exercised it, whatever that means, or been reckless or willfully blind by failing to take the necessary steps to ensure I was consenting. Lara struggled after this decision. In her final diary, Lara seriously considered the possibility that she had BPD and read a lot about the disorder. She went back and forth about the suitability of the diagnosis for her. In June 1995, she wrote, "Those doctors were wrong when they said I had borderline traits. I am a borderline personality. I need to adjust my expectations and ambitions to meet my long-term capabilities on a short-term basis. I can do well and succeed, but I'm never stable for long. The borderline in me shows itself, and I let it." Even when she felt the diagnosis fit her, Lara still saw it as distinct from her true self, a kind of vampire she invited onto sacred ground. But at a subsequent meeting with her psychiatrist, Lara admitted that her relationships, with few exceptions, had been stable, including her relationship with her current boyfriend and her mother, with whom she was close, which is quite unusual for a person with BPD. Lara assessed the disease and its categorization, sounding more like the pre-med student she was than a patient. She writes, "It appears to have taken psychiatrists and psychologists, or rather the American Psychiatry Association, several decades to clue into the fact that up to 75 or 80% of BPD people were abused, especially sexually, as children. There's also a possible inherited risk and an overlap with other categories in the DSM-3 and DSM-4, for example, major affective disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, and other personality disorders, which means this is not a distinct, homogeneous category, but instead a heterogeneous one with multifactorial etiology." Lara also recognized how hard it is to treat borderlines. "We're the type of person," she writes, "to avoid therapy in the first place, or to accept it but not allow it to help. Maybe because we're afraid of trusting a therapist, we're comfortable in the sick role and thus are afraid to terminate therapy and admit we're better, and or we can't build up enough self-esteem and identity to benefit from practical therapy." Reading these sentences, I marvel at what an amazing doctor Lara would have been, and I wish my doctors in my 20s and 30s had been more like her. But Lara didn't get the chance to study medicine. In summer 1995, Lara received rejection letters from the 3 Canadian medical schools she'd applied to. On September 12th, Lara wrote, "Was it really the same Lara who did medical research last summer? She's gone and left this pathetic, brainless shell in her place. God, I'd forgotten how a solid depression feels, the kind that doesn't lift for even an hour. I feel so heavy." 3 days later, she could see right through herself. "Looking at myself," she writes, "I see a pale, translucent person who has been pretending to be solid and real." In her final pages, Lara obsesses over the loved ones she'd leave behind if she ended her life. Her concern for the people in her life, especially her boyfriend Bob, who had just started law school, made her hesitate to share her feelings with them, but also to end her life. "I feel close to cracking up. I don't see a reason to continue except to avoid hurting other people. I want to die, but somehow without leaving the people I love with my own pain." Her care for those around her persisted even as she lost the ability to concentrate on the simplest task. She even worried about the financial pressure her suicide would cause Bob because she just moved into an apartment with him and was paying half the rent. Lara also dreaded a future attenuated by depression, underlining in her journal the statistic that 90% of people who experience 2 depressive episodes will suffer through another. "Right now," she writes on September 18th, 1995, "I see a big black nothing when I think of my future. Even back in 93, when I felt at rock bottom, I still held the hope of one day going into medicine. Now I don't want to be a doctor and deal with all that stress and responsibility." Lara decided to try electroconvulsive therapy as a last measure, about 3 years before Pamela Tusiani would undergo it in the US. "So I'm giving things another 2 or 3 weeks," she writes on September 27th, 1995. "If electroshock therapy doesn't work, I'll have tried everything and will feel more justified in going ahead with my plan." She checked into a psychiatric hospital where she writes the next day, "Anyway, good night, and please, Lord, let tomorrow's electroshock therapy be the beginning of a successful treatment for me." She never wrote another entry. Lara Gilbert died by suicide 9 days later while home from the hospital on a weekend pass at age 22. But she didn't end. When she was 18, Lara promises her diary, "I will live a finite number of years, and what exists apart from me will also. But everything connected together will live forever. Each part of reality will come and go, but always replace then give way to another part. These connections, overlappings, create an infinity that is so important because it defies an end, a nothing." In an essay for Room, a Canadian literary magazine in which Lara's mother had also published work, I wrote about the emotional impact of my archival research into Lara's life and the parallels with my own memories. Handling the original manuscripts in the archives felt sacred. If you're interested in reading another posthumously published diary written by a woman with BPD and compiled by her family, please check out Remnants of a Life on Paper, A Mother and Daughter's Struggle with Borderline Personality Disorder. Remnants of a Life on Paper was published by Beatrice Tusiani and Paula Tusiani-Eng a decade after Beatrice's daughter and Paula's younger sister, Pamela, died in 2001 at the age of 23. The book contains excerpts from Pamela's diary over the last 3 years of her life, during which she was being treated for BPD, substance abuse, and depression, reproductions of some of her artwork from that period, a collection of her incredible inventive poems from that period, her mother's commentary on the events, and deposition transcripts from a lawsuit that the family initiated following her death. Pamela did not die by suicide, but rather due to caretaker negligence when the residential facility in which she was living failed to properly monitor her diet and respond promptly to a drug reaction. In an earlier episode of A Real Affliction, I interview Paula Tusiani-Eng about her beloved sister's life and death and how Pamela inspired her to co-found Emotions Matter, a New York-based nonprofit supporting people with BPD and their loved ones through all kinds of peer support groups, fundraising activities, workshops, and other events. Even though I didn't handle Pamela Tusiani's handwritten journals, reading Remnants of a Life on Paper held me spellbound in a similar way. I see so many connections and overlappings between Lara's and Pamela's diary entries, experiences, pains, and graces, and between their lives and mine. Reading their diaries also shows us how far we've come. When Lara and Pamela were combating BPD in the early 1990s, electroconvulsive therapy was one of the few therapies doctors offered to them. At the time, Marsha Linehan was still testing and codifying dialectical behavior therapy, or DBT. But today, we have so many options that Lara and Pamela didn't have. We have DBT, we have other evidence-based treatments like mentalization-based therapy, schema therapy, and transference therapy. Other people with BPD are having success with things like EMDR therapy and somatic experiencing. We also have support in the form of our very vibrant social media community and online peer support groups. And I truly believe both Lara and Pamela would want us to do the hardest thing, the most gorgeous thing: live. I want to thank all of my guests from the first year of A Real Affliction, BPD Culture and Stigma. They are Bailey McKnight, Jesse Shepard, Dr. Sarah Maslin, American McGee, Melanie Goldman, Paula Tusiani-Eng, Nina Shope, Ella Sander, Dr. Lisa Johnson, Dr. Alexander Chris, Michelle Baker, Lucy Ano, Courtney Stallings, and Lara Goldwyn. I also want to thank Ariel Silver, who provided the music that is playing right now, Clipped Wings, from her acclaimed album Watershed. So this ends the first year of the podcast, and I look forward to picking it up again after a hiatus. Thank you so much for listening. Take care of yourselves. The fight is worth it.
Like a mystic message prophesized, dawn broke and I saw clearly what it signified. The key was in my hold and I was all alone. I cried for help, calling out for someone else. All alone, I cried for help, but only I could save myself.